Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. How are you?
Let me share my screen. And everyone can see it, I presume? Yes, no?
I can.
Yes.
Can? Okay, great. Okay, so today we are going to basically be covering HTML and HTML forms, which is something that you'll be using in your second, just a moment. Here in Mingao, there is not, okay. So, and we have the wrong, just a moment. Wrong lecture notes up. Is this the right lecture notes? Nope. There we go. I thought I had the right notes up. Okay, so today we're covering HTML and forms in HTML, which you'll be using in your second web project when you lay out the three different segments of your data collection thing. You'll basically have three different forms, one for collecting student results for the performance levels, one for collecting information about assessment plans, and a third form for collecting narrative information. So that's the big thing today. Got to do a few introductory things about HTML that I just wanted to emphasize. Before I do that, I wanted to take questions about the database design for the first web project. I've been getting a bunch of questions on Piazza, and I was just curious whether anyone had questions for me today. The project, the first one, the web project, is due this coming Thursday evening, so you should be started on it. Everyone is pretty much okay, sounds like, right now? Okay.
I asked all mine already.
Okay. And if you have more, of course, it's fine to keep asking them on Piazza. Okay, so in that case, let's get going with HTML. So the book has kind of said it, but I will say it too. So the two things that we are talking about the next couple of days are HTML, which is basically the way you specify specifies content. And CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it specifies layout. So you try to separate the specification of content from layout. And HTML is what is called a markup language. So it uses tags, which in this case consist of markup between brackets, to specify markup commands. So for example, in HTML, you'll often see either B and something like Brad, and that means boldface, Brad. So there's all kinds of, or you'll see H1, and that's a header. So it specifies that it is a major header. So tags, as you can see, they have some label in the less than greater than, and then they end with a /. And so an HTML document, it basically starts, I always forget the exact syntax, so I have to go to my notes for that. And I forgot to print them out, so that's why you see me looking. Okay, starts with a doc tag. So normally when a document is loaded from the browser, see if I can get that. Nope. I was hoping that I could get that from the clipboard, so I'm just going to have to copy it in. So it's doc. So generally HTML documents start with this particular markup at the beginning. And by default, browsers tend to be pretty smart. If the file has normally your HTML files have a .html ending. So browsers are pretty smart. If it has a .html ending, you normally don't have to include this statement at the top of your document. But what it does is it tells the browser what kind of document is being loaded. So in this case, it's HTML. Then you normally have a header statement, a header. Yep, head. So you have a head statement, and that is markup. And then you have the body, which is what contains the content that gets displayed. So this is displayed content. This contains so-called metadata. So this is, for example, where you can import style files, which are CSS files. You can import scripts, files that are basically JavaScript that specify interaction. You can, for example, give a title to the document. You can do some other things. I normally restrict the use of head to importing style files, importing some script files, and sometimes putting a title in there. Then the body is where you put your content. And as I said, there's basically two. HTML divides content into inline content and block content. So block content starts on a new line. And inline continues the current line. So for example, that B that I showed you for boldface, it's considered an inline markup. The H1 that I showed you is a header. It's considered block content. So many examples of block content, but some of the most common ones are the headers, H1 through H6. The section markup that indicates I have a section. The pre, if you want to do code, you normally use pre for pre-formatted. Tables, lists. These are all things that create a new start on a new line. Things that, okay, so that's block content. Inline content is some surprising stuff, so not so surprising. So things like specifying that something is boldface or italic. Links that start with A are inline. This one often surprises. Images are inline. So if you're not careful with an image, it actually goes inline rather than in a new block. Okay. another common one, P for paragraph, starts a new paragraph. That's a block one that you will frequently use. And then there are some things, some special tags that you should be familiar with. HR, you don't need a closing tag for it. It creates something called a horizontal rule, which is a line, a horizontal line across the page like that. Another one, BR, stands for a line break. It forces a line break. So in HTML, \n has no meaning. If you want to create a line break, you have to use BR instead. And again, you don't have to have a closing tag for it. So line breaks, \n does not work. You have to use BR to force a line break. Other thing that's important is entity codes. So because of the fact that less than and greater than are used for tags, they can be misinterpreted. So a common one is, I'll show you, you try to do # include. So say # include standard.io.h. Okay, and what's going to happen is it's going to get interpreted as a tag. Okay, you'll see that there is some other stuff here. Don't worry about this other stuff. Just look at this include standard.io.h. And you'll notice # include, but no standard.io.h. And what happened is HTML ate the tag because it thought that this was a tag. Okay, so we have to have a way of telling it I want a real less than, and the way is with what's called an entity code. So in this case, ampersand starts the entity code, then the name is LT, then the semicolon indicates the end of the entity code. So an entity code is an ampersand. So an entity code is an ampersand, then the name. So I'll say entity name. And then a semicolon to denote the end of it. And sometimes they don't, there's so many of them, they don't have names. So sometimes they just have a decimal number. So then you start it with a hashtag and the number. And I think if you say X, I have to check that, then you can do it in hexadecimal. Let's just check that quickly. So you can check like for different things. So here I'm going to do a search for the for all entity code. And you can see I get different things for it, but I'm still not seeing how I do it with hex. So annoying. Try it. Yep, I was not right. It starts with a hash and then an X. Okay. So if you're doing hexadecimal, it starts with also $X and then the hexadecimal. So coming back to here, when I save this file and I redisplay it, now you can see I got my less than and greater than. Of course, using ampersand causes an issue, which is that it itself now becomes a entity code. So if you want an ampersand, you use amp as the entity code for it. So this is how on my test, I was able to get the various relational algebra symbols is I just went searching for the entity codes, and you can get all kinds of wonderful mathematical symbols using these entity codes. Okay, so just be aware of that. Okay. Want to talk about two other ones, the non-breaking space. So a couple other important entity codes are non-breaking space, which and there is a non-breaking hyphen, which of course doesn't have a, let's see what that one is. Look it up in my notes. It is 8209, okay. That is a non-breaking hyphen. So there are times when you don't want something broken into a new line. So let's say I want to have off campus, and I want to treat that as one word. If I just put a dash here, HTML will think it's okay to break the line and create off the end of one line and campus to start the next line. If you don't want that to happen, you could put a non-breaking space there and say instead, not a non-breaking space, a non-breaking hyphen. And now it would force off campus to be grouped together on one line. Or let's say I wanted to talk about a 5-kilometer race. And I want the 5 and the kilometer to appear on the same line. Instead of putting a space here, I would say 5 non-breaking space KM, and now it would treat it as one word and it will not break it across a line. So non-breaking space, non-breaking hyphen, which is number 8209, are useful entity codes that are probably worth memorizing because they come up a fair amount. Okay, so then you'll note that with the markup, you can often have attributes that specify information about things. So for example, an image has an attribute called source, where you give a file name for the image. So this is called an attribute. It always has the form attribute equals. And then you may have some other thing. In this case, you may want to confine the thing to fitting into a certain amount of width, like 200 pixels. So on the exam, I wanted to force my B tree to fit in a certain space on the exam. So I specified a width, and it automatically scales it so it will fit in that. There's something called the aspect ratio of an image. I think the book defined it as width divided by height. It's not something I will test you on. But if you only specify one of the two, it will automatically maintain that ratio. So for example, if the real width was 400 and the real height was, say, 300, and I specify a width of 200, then it would appear as a 200 by 150. So it will automatically scale the image. So those are the attributes provide additional information about the markup. So we'll see those as we go along. Okay, so just things that are useful. You saw them already. You can create in HTML ordered lists and unordered lists. So an ordered list starts with OL for ordered list, and then LI are the line items. So like foo, goo, who. You can have nested lists. A, B, okay, and you terminate them. Notice I'm not terminating the LIs, so the next tag that occurs implicitly terminates them. Good style would be to terminate them, but HTML is pretty good about figuring out when something has ended. Okay, so you can see here, it has done it. Now, this is an example where you might actually, when we have lists like this, they often have like A and B rather than 1 and 2. And we'll see when we get to cascading style sheets, how you can alter this kind of presentation so that you aren't stuck with 1, 2, 3. You can use like lower case alphabetic, uppercase alphabetic. You could use Greek letters. You could use Roman numerals. We'll see how you can do that using cascading style sheets. And then you can also create unordered lists with the UL. And you can see they're now bulleted. With HTML, it's easy to make mistakes. Let's say that I had forgotten to change the closing tag here so that it's UL here, but OL here. That can create some issues for you down the road. So let's keep going after the list. And you can see that you think you're after the list, but it's still indented. And that's because of my mistake back here, I didn't actually terminate this list. So it thinks that after the list actually belongs to this who line item. And so it's indenting it at the same level as who, because it thinks, in fact, that after the list is associated with the item who. So HTML doesn't actually give a lot of syntax errors. Instead, it just tries to carry on interpreting your file, and it can lead to some messed up formatting where you then just have to go back in and try to figure out where the error occurred. Normally, it's pretty clear from the visual presentation where the error occurred. Okay, so another helpful, actually I can make this a little bit bigger. Nope, too big. Okay, so another useful thing are tables. So they tend to be good for organizing tabular data, although they can also be good for laying things out, because CSS cascading style sheets get a little problematic with laying things out, as we'll talk about later. But with the table, they're organized into rows. So TR is the first tag for a row. Normally you want some header. So TH stands for header, column header, and it will be some special formatting. So I might like have a name and let's say a address. And now I end that row. Now I can start, TD is the entry for a column in a table. So I might have Brad and we have lights that went off in here. Not sure how to get them back on. Nope, that wasn't it. Okay, so we can do that, and we'll just end the table here. And you can see we get something that looks like a table. You can see that the things, table entries are centered. Now, one issue is it's hard to distinguish the entries, so I might add to the table a border. And now I get this border, although it's a little hard to see, but this border is a double border. And you might not like this double border. Again, CSS will give us ways to control this kind of layout so that you can collapse the border. And you'll notice I did not say border equals true, nor did I say border equals border. That is because border is considered a Boolean attribute. Its presence indicates true, its absence indicates false. So with Boolean attributes, you don't actually provide the equal in string. As I say, if it's present, it means it's true. If it's absent, it means it's false. Okay, and I can do things like with a thing, I can say call span equals 2. So maybe I want the next one to, I know my name, I gave a first and last name, I should have given an address, but hey, it is what it is. So on this one, what I'm saying is that, I'm sorry, that was one row. This is the next row. So I'm saying that this particular column should span 2 columns. So if you make this one visible, you can see how it spans both columns. So tables, very flexible. These are the most common attributes: border, call span. Row span, which is ROW, allows something to span 2 rows, also very helpful. So tables are your friend. You'll use them a fair amount. You can stuff anything you want into one of those cells. You could stuff a subtable into a cell. You could stuff an image into a cell. There's all kinds of things that you can stuff into those cells. These are what are called container objects. So that's kind of now moving into the next chapter of the book, where it talked about how HTML uses a container model for things. And TD, well, table is a container which contains rows. TR is a container which contains columns. TD is a container because it can contain a container itself, or it can contain just simple content. So these are all container objects that can contain other objects. Okay, so not really important that you know that it is a container kind of thing, just perhaps it helps visualize what HTML is doing. Okay, so let's make sure that I got images links. Yep, I got that. Okay, so let's move now into forms. And forms allow us to collect information, okay? And as I said, they'll allow us to collect the information that you saw in the ABET interface. So a form has 3 elements. It starts with a form tag. Then there are some number of widgets. Here I have an input widget and a P and another input widget for a telephone. So this one has 2, and then normally you have a submit button. Okay, and again, input things are inline content. So if I don't put these P's here, I will end up with them all on one line. So a form is a form element, some number of form widgets, and then a submit button generally, and then the end of the form. So we just do this very simply. Here's my slider. Here's my type in text box for the phone number, which isn't very helpful because notice it immediately goes out with something else. And then the default value you see here is submit query. Okay, which as you saw reset everything, but normally would also send some information to the server at this point. So the way that things get sent to the server is that forms have two attributes. A method, which indicates how, so method is an attribute that indicates how name value pairs get sent to the server. So the name value pairs are the name of the widget and its value. So generally each widget would have a name and a value. So here, this input right here, value is 24. I didn't name it, but I could name it something like name equals, say, grade or score. So now when this value is sent to the server, it's going to be sent as score 24. And how that's done, I haven't told you yet. So we will get to that. And there are two things for method. It's either get or put. So get puts the parameters in a user visible URL. Put hides the parameters so that prying eyes cannot see it. So generally, we use get for read-only requests, and we use put for confidential material, plus any write requests, plus long parameter values. And long can be a little hard to, it is system dependent, but it normally means, I think, greater than 4096 bytes. So you would specify up here either method equals get, or you say method equals put. And in a moment, I'll show how these parameters get bundled up, but there's a second thing, action equals, and this is the name typically of a script on the server side. So this is the name of the server-side script that you would like to be called when this particular form has its submit button hit. And the information that you entered in the form will be transmitted to the server as name value pairs using JSON. And then they'll be decoded on the server side, typically into a hash table, and then the server side script can access those values. And the action is either a absolute address. So the action is either a fully is a absolute address, which is a URL. So a URL is something that starts with HTTP or HTTPS. And then the, I always get this. always, yes, it is a colon double. So then not a hyphen, a colon, 2 forward slashes, and then the name. So for example, here is a fully qualified one. Or I could give a relative one. So I could say action equals, like that, or I could say action equals and just give a relative. When it's relative, then the server will look for the script file relative to the current directory. So looks relative, or server looks for file relative to directory that holds the HTML file. So this is a relative address. Okay, so the big thing is the put and get. So let's first look at the get, and let's actually go up here to form. And we'll say method equals get. We'll say action equals, let's just do this one here.
What about post? I had a question. Like, I was wondering what the difference between post and put is, because they seem very familiar or very similar.
Okay, yes. Put, I believe, is used when you have an existing value and you mean to change it, so replace. And I think post is when you don't have a existing value and you need to insert it, is my understanding. So
Gotcha.
pretty subtle. I've always tended to use post, but yes, I think put is when you're replacing, post is when you're inserting something new. Okay, so let's add a name here, telephone. I think we got it. Let's display it. And we'll change the value to 41. We'll put 6144861 like that. We'll submit the query. Now, I know that the requested URL was not found. That's not what I'm trying to show here. What I am trying to show is this tag, which I will dump into here so you can see what's going on. So the get generated this URL. So this was the action. Then you see this question mark. So that's the delimiter showing the end of the action and the beginning of the parameters. Then you see score equals 41. So that's name equals value. Then you see an ampersand. That's the delimiter that separates the name value pairs. Then telephone equals. And now you see this percent. So if we go back here, I think it's reset, unfortunately. It did. But you see a %28. So %28 is a parenthesis. So that's a special character that can't be transmitted directly. So it's transmitted instead, I believe, as its ASCII code. Then 614. Then %29, again, I believe is the ASCII code for a right parentheses. And then the dash. Let's go back here for a moment. And instead, I will enter some spaces. and I will submit the query and copy it into HTML for you. Now you notice some pluses. So a plus means a space. So this is all encoding that will be decoded on the server side. So on the server side, it actually would be the string 63 space 6868 space 68. Okay, so this is just an encoding to avoid confusing things when it's sent over to the server. So with get, it is encoded like this, and that means a hacker can write a URL like this, put it into a browser window, or actually just send it from a script, and the server will treat it as though it came from a web page. So when you use get, you're actually giving hackers the ability to bypass your form and directly enter these parameters. And I don't think any of you anymore use Code Assessor, which was a tool I wrote for CS102 that allowed you to write code and compile it on a website. But I did that for 102 back when I taught it. And originally, I had the code sent using get. Well, the first problem I ran into was that sometimes the code was longer than 4,096 bytes, and I had to change it. But another problem that caught me was that it was a honey trap for hackers. Hackers loved the thought that they could get onto the server and execute code. So that's what they were doing. They were actually using the fact that my method was get to upload sneaky code and try to do things. Fortunately, the server was a virtual server, so they didn't get anywhere. But I learned my lesson, which is get is pretty dangerous because it allows people to bypass your web page and directly access the server. Now, sometimes that's good. Like with Google, Google is happy to have you write a search request without actually going through the Google engine. So sometimes you're more than happy to allow people to search your website without having to go to the web page. In that case, get is good. But if you want to hide things, you use post. So now I'm going to change it to post. And I'll reload it. Of course, that didn't work. Submit query. And now you can see that all that is in the URL is the URL. And there's been an object created, which you don't see. It's called an AJAX request object often. And it is being sent. Actually, it's not an AJAX request object. It is just an object that's being sent. And it has the encoded information in it. Now, hackers can still find ways to sniff this, but it's harder. At least they can't see it. They can't type in a URL and get it to execute on your server. So post, puts another method, both more secure. If you want encryption, so if you're wondering what the S does, that causes the name value pairs to be encrypted. So for example, confidential information, generally you send it over HTTPS so that it gets encrypted. If it's just HTTP, it's not encrypted. Okay, so that's our basic thing for a form. Any questions thus far? Okay, so then the book talks about form widgets. It does a really good job. What I want to talk about with form widgets is just a few design things that the book doesn't talk about. So first of all, the book talks about a number of choice widgets. There are radio buttons, there are checkboxes, there are menus, there are menu lists, there are combo boxes. Okay, these are all ways to enter a choice. So allow you one or more choices. So normally, if you want to enter more than one choice, you would use a checkbox. Now, menus and menu lists and combo boxes all allow you to do multiple selections, but the user needs to know the magic key sequence to do multiple selections, and most users don't know the magic key sequence for their operating system. I don't know it off the top of my head for a Mac. I always have to look it up. So normally, if you want to allow more than one choice, you would use checkboxes. Okay. Now, what determines whether you use, let's say, radio buttons versus a menu versus the other way you can actually enter a choice is with a text field. Okay. So when do you use which? Normally you use radio buttons when there are fewer than 7 choices. Okay, why is that? Is because human working memory is roughly 5 to 7 items. And so human working memory means that if there's fewer than 7 choices, most people can look at a list of choices and instantly put all those choices into memory and select the one they want. More than 7 choices, and they have to do a linear search. And I know I got a comment in 365 when I said it, but I'll still do it. Basically, working memory is order 1, whereas non-working memory is order n. So if you have more than, you have bounded choices that are roughly probably between about 8 to 100, you would use a menu or a menu list or a combo box, depending on what you thought. Now, that's going to be a roughly order n search for the human perceptual system, because now it overwhelms the human working memory and you have to do a linear search. If you have more than 100 choices, whoops, roughly speaking, use a text field, because now there's just too many choices. For example, zip codes are limited. There's only 100,000 of them, but that's too many to represent. So you would typically use a text box for a zip code, unless you can limit it. Like if I know it is Knox County, then the number of zip codes is limited, and I would probably use radio buttons or a menu. So if there's a way to limit it to fewer than 100 choices, you typically want to use something other than text to avoid allowing the user to make an error. The principle of user interfaces, or principle, of user interfaces, try to avoid allowing the user to make an error. So text invariably allows the user to make an error. Plus, it's based on recall memory rather than recognition memory. So another thing is try to leverage, so I should say 2 principles. 1, try to avoid the user making an error. Try to leverage recognition memory rather than recall memory. So recognition memory means when you see a choice, you say, ah, that's it. Like in a interface, you may forget what is the command to delete something, but when you see the command delete, you know, ah, that is it. Recall means you have to pull it out. You have to memorize it. So for example, your social security number, when you're entering it, it's from memory. It's recall memory. So recall memory is things that you have memorized, and you have, whereas recognition memory means you may not have memorized it, but if someone shows it to you, you will recognize it. So radio buttons, menus, menu lists, combo boxes take advantage of recognition memory, whereas text input does not. It requires recall memory. Okay. Then there are no, ways to input numbers. So the next big thing is inputting numbers. And there's two types of input for that. One is type equals number, which produces what is commonly called a spinner box, and type equals range, which produces a slider. Okay, so here you see I have type equals range, which created a slider. So in the web project you're doing, you're going to be using spinners for collecting numbers. And in general, what I've kind of found is that spinners just seem to be more prevalent. They seem to, I think, normally used in static situations, whereas range sliders tend to be more normally used when dynamic feedback is required. So for example, you are entering example colors are represented using RGB, red, green, blue values. And if you're trying to get just the right color, a slider is nice because then you can slide the, say, red slider around. These are normally values between 0 to 255 each. So you can sit there with a slider and you could vary it and you'd see the color just change as you change the value of the red. So that's what I mean by dynamic feedback is I might have a color to my right and I'm seeing what that red looks like as I modify it. Whereas with a spinner, it's not quite as conducive to this easy motion. With a slider, I just press and drag. With a spinner, I have to keep clicking. So at any rate, that's the difference. And again, sometimes you can't enter the number is unbounded. Again, a zip code is a number, but it's not really good to try to input it with either a slider or a spinner because there's just too many choices. So with a slider, the general rule of thumb is that, first of all, the number of values you can choose is limited by screen resolution. So for example, if there are 1200 pixels for the entire screen, that's the most number of values you could choose. But you probably wouldn't have just one pixel per value because it would be very hard to just get to that one value. So normally you would actually use 2 to 3 pixels per value so that there's a little fudge factor. The human can kind of move back and forth. Like if I'm trying to get here to 53, it would help if there's not just one pixel assigned to 53. It would help if there's 2 or 3 pixels assigned to 53. So that's called enhancing or enlarging the target area. Okay, whereas with a spinner, the number is not, okay, the number is unbounded, but obviously you don't want to have to just click through an infinite number of things. So there tends to be some limit on it. I, to be honest, have never really seen what that limit is. Okay, like you wouldn't enter a social security number using a spinner. So I would probably say probably certainly less than 1,000, I think, would be where that is. Now, just a cute trick. with sliders that I wanted to show you. You'll notice that this slider has a value associated with it. It's really annoying. I don't want this RoboForm thing here, but I probably can't get rid of it. I can. I'll get rid of the type equals telephone. Oh, stop it. It didn't stop it. Interesting. Huh. Oh, well. Okay. Normally, the problem with a slider is there's no value there. So if I just say input type equals range, name equals score, value is 24, min equals 1, max equals 100. And for a moment, I'm going to get rid of what the other stuff I have here. This is what you see for the slider. Default is very uninformative. You don't know what his current value is. You don't know what the min is. You don't know what the max is. No good. So normally, not normally, this is a cute trick. What you can do is put this output markup right next to it. And you'll notice I have this attribute on input. You don't need to know right now what's going on because we haven't talked about events, nor have we talked about JavaScript. But this is an event, and this is some JavaScript. And what it is doing is it's assigning the next element sibling. So we'll find out when we get to JavaScript that trees are used to represent HTML content, and that in this tree, this range input is a sibling with this output. They're neighbors. So it's saying, get my next sibling, assign its value to be my value, this dot value. And what that means is, as I move this, whoops, I haven't saved it again. It means that as I move the slider, I see what the value is. Now, obviously, I'm missing a min and a max. So I would probably want to, before this thing, add something like a label that said that the min is 1. I probably want to add something that said that the label, the max is 100. Although this is going to mess things up because you'll see the 100's going to change now. Actually, the 100 did not change because it's a label. So, but my output had to be put inside of the label. And unfortunately, that means that you don't really know what the difference is, that this is the current value, this is the current value, and this is the max. So that's just a simple trick. We'll show when we get to JavaScript, we'll find out that there's other ways that you can get the this value here to be either above or below the slider, but too complicated for the time being. So any rate, that's the trick. This on input to right here. Okay. So, okay, we have forms. We talked about get, post, action, selection widgets. So talked about sliders, text fields. Okay. So with, again, the name field is important for a widget because that is the name that will be sent to the server. Value is important. Another attribute you'll often see is ID equals, and that's a unique identifier. So I might have ID equals student score. So ID is a unique name for this markup element. Okay, it should be unique for the entire HTML document. And as we'll see, this is used to generally used for styling purposes, so that you can select this markup with CSS and be able to easily style it. Let's see. So those are the important ones. Okay, also, again, with the book emphasized it, but normally, so widgets are typically unlabeled. So use a label to label them. And that also helps with accessibility for people who have difficulty reading a screen. There are screen readers, and these labels can be associated with the widget, so the screen reader can tell the person what's going on. And you can either embed a widget in a label, so you can say label say color, and then you could have some radio buttons, input type equals radio, blah, blah, blah. Or, so that's called embedded. Or it could be outside of it. And then you have to use a for attribute to indicate what it's for. And this is where the ID comes into play. So you might say for equals red button. And then here you would have input type equals radio, ID equals red button. And this for and this ID, whoops, I forgot to put a, now link the two. So a screen reader knows that this label is associated with that widget. And in case you did not actually see it as you read through the notes, with radio buttons, if they're all part of the same group, they use the same name. So if I want radio buttons for, well, let's see, I think I actually have a something that, yes, forms.html. So if I go to web home, nope. Well, maybe if I typed it in properly. Still no. Okay, let me check something. There it is, form.html. Oh. Okay, so here we have simple form. How would you rate your skill in programming? Beginner, intermediate, advanced, super hacker. Then you see, so these are all in a line. These are going down. You can see here's some check boxes, here's a menu, some other stuff. But if we look at the page source, which on, I know I'm old fashioned, I still use Mozilla, but most of them have, browsers have a way to look at page source. So we can see what's going on. So you can see here, I didn't use a label. Instead, I said, well, I introduced it with a paragraph, how would you rate your skill in programming? But then notice for each of my radio buttons, it's the same name. Name equals skill, name equals skill, name equals skill, name equals skill. That's what puts them all as part of one group, or identifies them as being part of one group to the browser, so that if you select one, the previously selected one will be deselected. You'll notice that to get them to be in a vertical line, this is where BR was used, and this is now deprecated. It used to be you were supposed to close everything. These days you just say BR and not worry about the closing tag for it. Here, checkbox. This is a little bit unusual too. If you want to indicate that they're all part of the same group, you would again use the same name, but you would put these two brackets to, looks like an array, because actually that is how it would get transmitted to the PHP script, is as an array. So now you're saying these 4 checkboxes all belong to the same group, and the if it gets transmitted, it should now get transmitted as an array to PHP. Okay. So same thing down here with state. Just so you know, again, you no longer would say multiple equal multiple. This is old fashioned. Now you just say multiple because it's a Boolean attribute. And the reason there's an array thing here is because of the multiple. So anytime you're going to allow multiple selections in an HTML widget, for PHP at least, you need to include this array notation in the name. Otherwise, PHP will only give you the last selected. That's not true. It'll give you, I think, the first selected item. Okay. So questions about any of this?
Can I add a clarification about the post versus put from earlier?
Yep. Go ahead.
So a couple things. First of all, it totally depends on the server. Like servers can do whatever they want with a put versus a post.
Okay.
And a get, like there's no thing, but anyways, if they're following the HTTP spec, the main difference is that when you do a put request, you're requesting a modification or a creation of the actual resource the request is against. So the URL specifies the resource, and the body of the put is supposed to be applied to that target resource.
Okay.
With a post request, it's not.
Okay, so put is supposed to be a create or modification of the indicated resource. And
Yes, and a post that's not true. You can post to like, some form processor.php or whatever, and you would include in the body like the resource that you're really wanting to modify, and it would be a different resource.
Oh, okay. I may have to look that up. That doesn't quite. Okay, so it sounded like what you said was that both put and post in the body had the resource that was being modified. I'm guessing, I don't think it really matters from my experience.
It depends on the server you're talking to.
Okay.
But that's the spec. Like if you read
okay.
the RFC from Roy Fielding and them, that's the main difference.
I will have to look at it further. So looks like put also has to do with create and modification, and post certainly would deal with just a general query, but let me look that up after class. Check further. Other questions about this or comments?
I can create a Piazza post with the details that I'm aware
perfect.
of.
If you could do that with Piazza, that would be perfect. Okay.
Could you just go over the array notation stuff again for PHP?
Yes. Okay. So with PHP, anytime you want to allow multiple selections, so for example, here with the checkbox, I am saying that these 4 checkboxes all belong to this agree group. So if I want to, the way I signal to the browser that it is to transmit an array of choices is with this array notation. So if I leave it off, then even though I can select multiple checkboxes, the browser will only transmit one of my selected choices. So anytime a widget, a choice widget, is going to be, you want it to be able to transmit multiple choices, then when you name the widget, you need to use this array notation.
Got
And
it.
that tells the browser to transmit the choices as an array. If you leave it off, even though you've selected the multiple, specified that multiple choices are allowed, while the user will be able to select multiple choices in this menu, only one of those choices will get transmitted to the server. And I think it's the very first selection that gets in physical order that gets transmitted. So that's what's up with that array notation. Also, I guess I have not talked about it. Comments, that's is what this is. So an HTML comment, the less than sign, an exclamation mark, and 2 dashes, and then end it with 2 dashes and a greater than sign. So that content will not appear in the document. So if you want to comment, that is the way to do it. Okay, so in summary, so you'll notice, let me actually go quickly to the project assignment. So you'll notice that, let's see. Well, I may not have said it in here, but I certainly did. Okay, so assign a weight from 1 to 100. Well, there are attributes. So that's first of all going to be a spinner, which is a number. And there are min and max attributes that allow you to specify that. With a narrative, I certainly said it in the video, and I think I will also end up saying it in the description that for a narrative, the student's strengths and weaknesses are required, and the actions are optional. Well, turns out there is a attribute called required. It's a Boolean attribute that you can add to a widget that indicates that the user must provide a value for that widget and if they try to hit submit and they have not provided a value for it, the submit will fail and it will say that a value is required. So for example, with action, so we'll have input type equals text, and it's going to be a text area, but it's not going to be required. And when things are not required and you don't enter anything for them, then that name value pair is not sent to the server. So that is something you have to be careful about, is you can't assume for a non-required attribute. So on the server side, you cannot assume that a non-required name value pair will be present. So remember I said that On the server side, typically these name value pairs end up in a hash table. So you can't just assume that a non-required name will be in that hash table. You have to check to make sure, whereas with a required name, it should be there. So just be aware that in the project description, when I specify things like assign a weight from 1 to 100 or specify that something is required, go back to the book and look, because there are, or do a search. These attributes are available to you that will allow you to control things. And again, the book does a very nice job. I'll let you go in just a moment, but I just want to show you that the book does a very nice job. I think it's here. Of going, let's see, come on. Okay, it's not. But they are doing a very good job of going through all the different ones and giving you the important tags. Where is, what I'm trying to find is additional form widgets, date picker, color picker, number, range. Here it is, input attributes. So it does a nice job of giving you the important attributes like required, min, max, max length for characters. So I didn't go through all this because I would bore the living daylights out of you, but the book does a nice job of giving you the important attributes that occur most often, and in fact, the ones you will need for the web project. Okay, so with that, I'm going to let you all go. On Thursday, we're going to move on into cascading style sheets and how they can be used to style the appearance of things. So like this table has a, as you can see, a light gray background in the header, and it has just a single line for the border. So we'll talk about how you can control the layout using CSS. There's another example. These columns here, the headers are centered, but the values in the cells are left justified. So all that kind of layout can be done with cascading style sheets, and we'll see that on Thursday. Okay, just a reminder, because I'm here and I have to get home for office hours, I bumped them back 15 minutes. So they'll be from 3 to 4 today, rather than 2:45 to 3:45. So with that, I'll let you all go.